Hi, welcome to AIS LING 210 American Indian Languages course. I'm Wilson de Lima Silva, and this is lesson 1 of the course. Native American languages are spoken from Siberia to Greenland and from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. They include the southmost language of the world, Yaghan, and some of the northmost, Inuit. There is no consensus on how many indigenous languages there are. The estimates vary, but it probably numbers in the low thousands. Ethnologue, one of the sources that I checked, mentioned 1,060 individual languages. In terms of language families, including language isolates, there are 180 language families in the Americas. 58 of them are in Canada and in the United States. There are 14 languages families in Mesoamerica, including Mexico, and 108 in South America. Considering that there are 350 language families in the world, the Americas concentrate more than 50% of them. But before we dive into talking about these languages, I want to address in this lesson some of the myths and misconceptions about American Indian languages and indigenous languages in general. The first one is about diversity. There is a popular misguided notion that indigenous peoples can understand each other's languages. Of course, this is not true. The indigenous languages of the Americas are highly diverse, and the histories and classification are still being disentangled. Unfortunately, the average person knows little, if anything, about the indigenous groups of this continent and their cultures. So there is a tendency for some people to think in terms of the Indians as one ethnic group and who speak a single Indian dialect. This is wrong and actually racist. The term Indian as a collective designation for Native Americans is an European concept. What complicates this even further is that many indigenous groups are known by exonyms, and some of these are pejorative. Many of these names were given by colonial settlers, for example, Orejon, from Spanish meaning big ears, Patagon, from Spanish meaning big feet, or it may be a term given by neighboring indigenous groups to refer to people from other groups, for example, Tapuya, which means enemy in Tupi-Guarani, and was applied by Tupi people to many non-Tupi groups. So many non-Tupi groups were called Tapuya. For example, in Amazonia, the Waikihana people were called Piratapuya in Ngatu, a Tupian language. And the Piratapuya was the name for which the Waikihana people became known by the outsiders. The word wai means fish, and kana refers to people, so we have fish people. Currently, many indigenous groups are requesting, rightly so, that outsiders use the name of the group's self-designation when referring to the group. Referring to indigenous groups as they self-identify is a matter of respect. In the description of this video, you'll find some links to materials where indigenous peoples discuss the importance of names and references to their group identity. Please take a look at them. Another misconception is that people, especially the youth, do not want to learn their heritage language. As the languages of their parents and grandparents start to fade and cease to be spoken, their sense of identity may begin to dissipate. This has been linked to depression, drug abuse, and suicide rates. Fortunately, many younger members of indigenous communities have begun to show renewed interest in their history, their language, and their heritage. In many indigenous communities, we see initiatives for language conservation, language revitalization, and language reclamation. Many of these are led by community members who did not learn their language as their first language, but are eager to learn them and pass them to their own children. Plus, many young people are involved in developing language apps, games, videos, musical recordings in their languages. Some are enrolled in language programs in community schools and at universities. All this shows that Indigenous people, regardless of how assimilated they may be in the Western culture, usually want to hold on to their heritage, their languages, and their identities. Another common misconception is the notion that, well, everyone should just speak English, Portuguese, Spanish, insert any colonial language in here. My impression is that statements like this one seems to come mostly from monolingual speakers. Of course, I realize that you would have a hard time getting by in a country like the US if you spoke only Cree, or in Brazil or Colombia if you spoke only the Sanu. But for many indigenous communities that are working on the preservation of their language, they are not talking about being monolingual only. Many of them speak the colonial languages of these countries, and many are integrated with the mainstream society. The colonial dominant language works for everyday use, there's no question about that. But they may not fill the void left by the laws of the heritage language, and they don't carry the same meaning. In the Native for Linguistics workshop, organized in 2018, at the Linguistics Society of America annual meeting in Salt Lake City, members of different indigenous groups, when asked what language meant to them, they said things like language is life, language is spirituality, language is medicine, language is identity, etc. My friend John Vargas, a speaker of Mutean, who also speaks 5 other languages, including Spanish, said this about the language of his group. The Mutea language is full of knowledge. All the meaning of being Mutea is in the language. Language gives us power to tell our own history and to understand the world. Our language is the only tool to transmit our traditional knowledge to the younger generations of Mutean people. Then, as regarding Spanish, the colonial language of Colombia, John says, I also find important to know Spanish because this is the language I use here in the city to speak to the non-Mutean people, and also the language used in the schools and by the government. And he continues, I like to be able to communicate in other languages, but at home here in Mitu and in our Mutean village, we only speak in our languages. We prefer to leave Spanish to the outside. These examples show us that every language has its use and it's valuable to its speakers. Another misconception is that indigenous languages cannot convey modern ideas or new concepts. If you are a linguistic major, you may already know that any human language is capable of conveying new ideas. Just because a language doesn't have a global international presence, doesn't have a writing tradition, or is only spoken by a few people of small villages in the Amazon, it doesn't mean it is outdated, backward, or primitive. Speakers of many indigenous languages have been taking steps to keep up with these digital times and developing several resources such as films, cartoons, animations, language apps, websites, online dictionaries in the language. Speakers of Navajo, for example, have recently translated a full version of Star Wars and Finding Nemo into their languages, and have created language apps for smartphones. This shows that Navajo and many other indigenous languages are more than capable of remaining relevant and perfectly modern. In terms of writing, there is a common misconception that Native American languages have no tradition of older written texts. However, a number of indigenous languages have their own writing systems. For example, the Cherokee syllabary developed by the Sequoia, a Cherokee speaker. The Cherokee syllabary inspired the development of syllabary for other Native American languages, like Cree syllabics used by Cree and Ojibwa, the Chippewa Cree syllabary based on the Cree syllabary, Inuit syllabary also based on the Cree syllabary, and for Mi'kmaq, there was both a hieroglyphic and syllabic version of Mi'kmaq writing. And of course, many of you may be familiar with the quite sophisticated Mesoamerican hieroglyphic systems of the Aztec, Mixtec, Zapotec. All of these were from pre-colonial times. Finally, something I usually hear is, why care? Why care about endangered languages if they are going to die anyway? Well, it's true that in many cases, there is not much that can be done when a language only has a few speakers, and it's not being passed on to the younger generations. And this is indeed very sad and unfortunate. As you will see in this course, there are many languages that have less than 10 speakers alive. In these situations, the work ahead can indeed be challenging, but it's not impossible. Languages in these situations are the most in need of immediate documentation efforts. Sometimes the community may not have the resources or time to invest in language preservation and revitalization efforts. But they usually can do the next best thing, which is to document the language in audio and video so records of language and traditional knowledge could serve as resources for language revitalization and reclamation efforts, which may result in new speakers. So for many groups, documentation of the last speakers is better than the total loss of the language. To conclude this lesson, I want to say that indigenous languages are rich in history and knowledge. They are always worth learning, preserving, and documenting. And many indigenous communities in the Americas have been at the forefront in developing strategies for language revitalization, also important best practices for linguistic work and language documentation in general. We will discuss these themes in future lessons. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Ciao.